minute, and it'll be 5 past, and then we'll. Come on in. Yes, you've probably been sent all around the houses. And, yeah, sorry about that. But we haven't started, so it's fine.
Okay.
Don't worry. No rush. There's tea and there's coffee if you'd like some. Don't hesitate. Just go and get some if you'd like.
Just apologize. I'm going to have to leave early.
Yeah, that's life. Yeah. Oh, would you like a clicker thing? That'd be nicer than the.
Yeah, I can move this.
No, I mean, I've got one if you.
Okay, I can move this.
Okay. Right, so let's get going. Apologies for the delay, everyone, but it's worth it. I promise you. It's a real pleasure to have Lisa Bortolotti, University of Birmingham. So I think this is it's a preview of a new project that you're undertaking. But it's worth mentioning that Lisa has been the PI on a 5-year European Research Council funded Project Perfect. The perfect project, perhaps. Where perfect stands for pragmatic and epistemic role of factually erroneous cognitions and thoughts, delusions and the like, and what role they play in our mental lives, and whether they can in fact be beneficial. Sometimes I wonder whether the key to getting an ERC grant is having a really good acronym. But in this case, I know that that's only a small part of the thing. It's a really interesting project. So I'm really excited to listen to what you're doing next. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, Lisa.
Thank you for the invitation, Alexander. So if you want to know more about Perfect, there are some leaflets on the side. And as Alexander was saying, this is really a preview of a future project that I'm hoping to get funded in some way. And it can be conceived as an extension of Perfect, but it's really looking at the way in which public debates happen in real life, on social media, and the role that personally significant stories play in those debates. Now, I think that that's a topic that can apply to a number of different debates, but I want to start thinking about mental health debates because, first of all, it's very close to the area that I'm researching. Second, I think they tend to be, in this time and age, debates that get very polarized, almost vicious on social media. There's quite a lot of personal attacks as part of it. So it's interesting to think about the way in which these debates are conducted and whether we as philosophers can in any way make suggestions about how to improve both the quality of the argumentation in the debates and reduce the extent to which they get polarized. So that's the background. Perfect explores really the potentially positive role that some beliefs that we normally dismiss as either false or irrational can play in our lives. And it's definitely not something surprising for you to hear that a false belief may be psychologically comforting. For instance, if I erroneously think I'm an excellent speaker, I might actually get the confidence to perform in front of a big audience. So even if my belief is actually false or is not really well grounded in my previous experience, in the evidence I've got, it might benefit my state of mind, it might even improve my performance. So my confidence may actually make me better at speaking in public. So that's not a surprise, but I think the more interesting aspect of Perfect is that we think that sometimes our epistemic functionality, so how we work as epistemic agents, how we get knowledge from the world, improves by having irrational beliefs. Now, of course, it depends on the particular case that we're looking at, but there are situations where certain beliefs, again, about myself or about my environment, might make me more intellectually curious, or might make me more in tune with the environment in which I am. Might make me more likely to obtain other beliefs that happen to be actually true rather than false. So these kind of dynamics are what interest us in perfect. And the point that we want to make is that sometimes it may be a bit restricted on a view for an epistemologist who is a philosopher who is interested in knowledge to focus only on truth and justification, truth and rationality, because sometimes beliefs may actually be good in epistemic ways, but in ways that do not involve being true or being justified. In the new project, I want to extend similar considerations that Imperfect we make about beliefs to personal stories, especially personal stories that are used in public debates. What kind of role a personal story can have in a debate, how it should be assessed, and why does it matter that a personal story is used in a debate. So in Project Perfect, we make the claim that beliefs play different roles. They are not just ways of representing the world, but they may be ways in which we, for instance, manifest our agency. There may be ways in which we interact with other agents, and so on. And I think that point is really magnified when you think about stories. Like, stories can have lots of different roles. They can give us information, they can entertain us, they can be a challenge to something that we believe, they can be a means of education or of motivation, they can be inspiring, they can bring people together, and at the same time they can divide and antagonize people. And all of these things might be going on in the same story. So, for instance, you could have a story that is not factually accurate, maybe historically you don't find that the story represents how things went, but it may have a very strong motivational power. It might kind of make you think that you or your group have the capacity to change things for the better, for instance. And some of these effects the stories have are really reflected in the goals of the storyteller. So the person who is telling the story wants you to learn about something, or to be motivated, or to act in a certain way. But sometimes stories have a life of their own. So they are out there, someone has told the story, but then the story has been shared, maybe it has changed, and the effects of the story are sometimes very difficult to predict, and they may be quite different from what the storyteller originally wanted to do with the story. I think this impacts on what we think about when we think about a story being successful. Because it's quite difficult to think about a story being successful without thinking about what the story is for. And as I said before, there can be a story that is incredibly engaging, beautifully worded, so aesthetically very pleasing, very successful. At the same time, it may not represent things as they are. It may even be misleading in the kind of information that it conveys. So is it successful or not? Well, it depends. It depends. And so I think it is quite important when we are listening to a story or just about to share a story to think about what the role of the story is. Now, there are some people who say that stories are always fictional. So also when you try, even when you try to tell people something that reflects reality, the way that you represent things is always a modification, is always a way of changing reality, of offering your own interpretation. And so in that light, I think it's important to think about stories as having different success conditions. And I think this becomes important when stories are used in debates. Because sometimes we are moved by a story because it's engaging and beautiful, it brings us to tears, and we tend uncritically to buy the message that is behind the story, or the kind of way of representing the world that the story is pushing. Whereas maybe what we need is like some kind of critical distance. So we may recognize that the story is successful in leading us to feel in a certain way, and at the same time want to think a little bit more about whether the story should be a reason for us, let's say, to change our mind about something, or to go out and vote in a certain way, and so on. one thing that you may notice if you are on Twitter a lot is that people debating don't often debate by proposing formal arguments. Partly it's the nature of the medium, like you don't have that many characters that you can use, but partly is also the immediacy of the medium, the fact that you want to kind of make a point quite quickly and to get a reaction from your audience. And a lot of the public debates that are happening on social media, but not exclusively on social media, are, I think, driven by personally significant stories. I think one obvious example, and I'm mentioning it just because I think we hear a lot about it, is the debate about Brexit after the referendum. So a lot of the campaigning, both in favour and against Brexit, has been driven by personal stories. Look at this scientist who got this amazing grant from the European Union. That's what you're losing. Or look at my dad, he never managed to get a good job because there was always a European citizen more qualified than him. You know, that's there is a lot of that, and sometimes the story is accompanied by a formal argument or an informal argument, so that it's just a way of illustrating the argument. But a lot of the times the story is the argument, is the self-standing argument. The idea is that this happens, thus, we have to act in a certain way. I haven't chosen the Brexit debate today because I feel too strongly about it, so you just get kind of too emotionally involved. So I've chosen a debate where I don't actually have a specific stance. And we'll look at it in a second, because what I want to focus on is not who is right, which side is the right side of the debate, but I want to focus on how people make their points, how people argue that debate. I think there are some interesting philosophical questions that we can ask ourselves if you agree that stories sometimes are used as arguments. So there are questions about how we get knowledge, so what can we learn from a story, what kind of things we can hope to learn from a story. Can a story ever be a good argument? Because we can obviously imagine situations where the story doesn't generalize and is not a good argument. But can we also think about situations in which the story makes a good argument, is by itself a good argument? And if so, how do we make these evaluations? Being a good argument, being a bad argument, when we think about stories? I don't think philosophers have thought a lot about that. And I also think there are ethical issues, especially when the public debates are important and are the way in which people are influenced in their actions by campaign for certain views, lobby politicians and so on. So are we responsible for how we tell, or how we consume, or how we share the stories that are used as arguments? If so, what is responsibility? How does it manifest? What are we responsible of actually? Are there any norms that should regulate the use of stories in a debate? I think those are all interesting questions to which I don't have an answer, but what I really want to see is whether you agree with me that there is something to be investigated here, whether this is actually a problem that we should think about. So there are also potential applications to thinking about how personally significant stories are used in public debates. For instance, whether the use of story impacts on the quality of the argumentation, or even impacts on the shape of the debate, the direction of the debate. Maybe even impacts on how long the debate is going on for. Can we improve exchanges in public debates by becoming better aware of the different roles that stories play in those debates, and focusing on their role as arguments as something that needs to be evaluated and more reflectively examined. And I'm particularly interested in the connection between using personal stories and polarization in debates. So I have this hunch that there is a connection, but I think it's an empirical question, and I think it would be interesting to study that empirically. Are those debates where personally significant stories used this tendency to become more polarized? And is that obviously a bad thing? There is quite a lot of debate in this new field, which is political epistemology, about whether polarization is bad. We tend to assume it is bad, And there are some people, I think, who have pretty good reasons to think it's bad. Like, you tend not to take your opponent seriously if the views become too polarized. But I think there is something interesting here. How do stories impact on the polarization of the debates? And can we avoid polarization if we use personal stories more responsibly? Okay, so I said I wanted to focus on a debate that I haven't really made my mind up on yet, which is a debate about the nature of distress in mental health. But before I go to the debate, I think we need to say a little bit more about how stories are used in mental health more generally, not necessarily in debates. Because arguably, personally significant stories have a special role to play when they are stories about mental health. So they've got many of the features of stories that I've talked about before, intended and non-intended effects, but I think they might have some additional features that are interesting, and that make it even harder to think about how we can evaluate personal stories in debates. If someone with a lived experience of mental health issues share their story, I think they do something very valuable. They enable us to share an experience that may be quite unusual. That's not always the case, but think about quite unusual experiences. For instance, the experience of having a thought inserted into your head, which is sometimes common in schizophrenia, or certain auditory or visual hallucinations that people have. Those may be quite unusual experiences, and a person who does not have them might find it very difficult to understand what the person who has them is going through. So by telling the personal story, they kind of open a window. It's a very brave thing to do in many cases, because we know that there is a very strong mental health stigma in our society. But what they do, they open a window so we can look in. We are still not able to understand exactly what it is like from the inside, but we can get more information about what the experience is like and what effects it might have on the person's behavior, feelings, and so on. Because of that, personal accounts are found to inform research and clinical practice. So for instance, a journal like the Schizophrenia Bulletin always has the last paper, it's a first-person account. And I find incredible descriptions, for instance, of people having delusions, trying to manage their delusions. They give a real insight in how it is to live with those symptoms, with those beliefs. Another role that stories about mental health have is that they may create, challenge, or perpetuate either positive or negative stereotypes that are associated with a mental health issue. And I think that depends very much on the story that is being told and how the story is being received. But definitely they shape self-perception, contributing to either self-stigma or self-advocacy. So if I'm a young person, confused, who doesn't really understand what is going on but is experiencing distress, and find a story of someone else who seems to have similar experiences, who accounts for those experiences in a particular way, I might have this sense of, oh, that's what happens to me, that's what I am. And then the story that is told might change the way in which I think about myself and my own experiences, in a positive way or in a negative way, depending on the story. But it seems to have this very powerful effect. So there is a sense in which stories are significant, especially when they are first-person accounts of distress or accounts by caregivers who talk about their own experiences of mental distress in people they take care of or people in their families, friends, and so on. They allow us to understand what an experience that may be described as puzzling is like from the perspective of the person who is having the experience. In the best case, a good story challenges negative stereotypes. So, for instance, one thing that is often associated with schizophrenia, and that's why many people have argued that diagnosing schizophrenia is unethical, is that when the person receives the diagnosis of schizophrenia, some people say it's like receiving a death sentence. because the conceptions that we associate with schizophrenia are a chronic condition that can only get worse, it's very difficult to manage, that will disrupt my own life. Now, as it happens, that's not true. There are people who receive that diagnosis who can manage their symptoms and go on to live very good lives, but that's not the received, or at least the first reaction that people have when they hear about schizophrenia and talk about schizophrenia. So a very well written memoir, such as the one that Roberta Payne wrote, Speaking to My Madness, How I Search for Myself in Schizophrenia, can really help. Roberta is extremely articulate. She describes how much actually schizophrenia disrupted her life, so she's not romanticizing the condition at all. It's a very moving and difficult to read story. But she also tells how in time she's learned to manage her symptoms and go on to achieve the kind of things that she wanted to achieve. And so it's a story that I think gives a positive association to the idea that schizophrenia is not a death sentence. That there will be difficulties, but it will be possible in some circumstances at least to overcome those difficulties. And I think you can say something similar about a very interesting movie that UK director Carol Morley has presented at the London Film Festival recently, Out of Blue. By the way, Carol Morley was a resident at the Wellcome Trust, so she is really interested in mental health issues. It's not an accident, I think, that she wrote this fantastic movie. It's an adaptation of a story, but very different from the original book, where the main character, Mike, experiences a lot of symptoms that we might want to describe as like the psychotic symptoms, but these symptoms are not just negative. We can see that they disrupt her life in many ways. We can see that her life is not, as we standardly conceive of, a happy, well-adjusted life, but they also contribute to her solving a mystery. She's a police detective, and also overcoming some of her problems. So we get, I think, a very well-rounded view of what it is to have a mental health condition. The character is never pigeonholed as having a mental health condition. There are no words like schizophrenia or PTSD mentioned in the movie. It's just the person in that environment having those experiences. And I think this kind of story can also help. It's a fictional story this time, but it can also help undermine certain stereotypes. On the other side, of course, there are stories that can spread myths and perpetuate negative stereotypes or positive stereotypes that do not have a lot of foundation in reality. So we all tend to perceive people from other groups as much more homogeneous than people from our own group. This is a bias that we all have, and Allport identified a long time ago and described as out-group homogeneity. That means that when we think about members of a group that is not our own group sharing a certain characteristic, we tend to think that all members of the group share that characteristic, and there is more than a contingent relationship between belonging to that group and having that characteristic. And I think that happens with mental health conditions a lot. So for instance, there is this idea that people who have mania, people with bipolar disorder in the manic phases are very creative. Not just very creative, they're like that kind of creative. Geniuses or amazing artists. This idea that in order to be an elite artist, you need to be a little bit unstable. You know, that's very common in the popular culture. And although it's a kind of a romanticizing of mental health, it doesn't actually do a lot of good. The negative ones, I think, are even more harmful. So the identification, for instance, of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia as violent, when it has been shown multiple times that people with that diagnosis are much more likely to be experiencing violence, being the victims of violence, than perpetrating violence. So those are the kind of myths that we associate with certain mental health conditions, and not because we are not careful, it's because very often the messages we get, for instance from the media, kind of pushes in that direction. Very often when newspapers report a crime, they use the word schizophrenic robbed or schizophrenic attacked. And so we identify the diagnosis with the action. But actually the person is lots of other things apart from having a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Maybe we want to know about those other things. So that's kind of interesting, but stories do have this effect as well. Now, in mental health debates, we do have personal stories being told, and often the idea is that these stories drive different views about what distress is like and how it should be addressed and how we should respond to distress. They have advantages with respect to other forms of argumentation that I think we need to acknowledge. So very often a vivid, engaging story is better at conveying complex ideas than a technical paper in an academic journal. And sometimes a vivid story is more effective at getting us to think about certain things than a table with a lot of statistics in it, right? The other thing is that they do create opportunities for people with lived experience of mental health issues to tell their stories, to tell their side of the issue, and in a valuable and authoritative way, for the reasons that I mentioned before, because they may be in a condition of having such experiences that that a lot of the other people participating in the debate don't have, and the fact that they tell their story enables this kind of window to be open. So there are certainly positive sides to sharing stories in mental health debates. But sometimes the mental health debate becomes a war, and I think it's quite appropriate to talk about it this way, because recently there has been a lot of engagement about what model of distress we should base interventions support. And it's definitely a debate that we can describe as public, because it doesn't just happen in academic conferences or kind of clinical context. It happens everywhere. It happens on social media, it happens in conversations. It involves mental health care providers and users, but also the general public more widely. And its outcomes will affect all of us, society at large. For instance, its outcomes might affect public policy and funding. Should we, for instance, give more money to enable more people to have talking therapies? Which is a debate that we've seen a lot also in the popular press. How should we think about pharmacological interventions aimed at reducing distress and so on? Also, it is conducted over the general press. It is in televisions and documentaries. I think there has been just a few days ago, a documentary on pill shaming and depression on the radio, All in the Mind. It's everywhere on Twitter and fora dedicated to mental health. What are the themes in the debate? Well, one is really about the role of diagnosis, psychiatric diagnosis. Is it valid? Is it scientifically valid? Is it helpful at all to receive a psychiatric diagnosis? What are the effects on the people who are at the receiving end? Does it enable support? Or, as some people say, it's a means of oppression and injustice. What attitudes should we have towards people who experience distress? How should we think of them? What is their role in the distress that they are experiencing? What is the role of society in the distress they're experiencing? And how should we respond to distress? So, is hospitalization ever a good solution? What about medication? What about other types of therapies, like psychological therapies? What about other forms of support, which are being experimented in other countries, for instance? So these are some of the themes in the debate. Now I'm going to give a really broad caricature of the different positions in the debate, because, as I said, my point is not to discuss the merits of these positions, it's just to tell you about how this debate is conducted. So the biomedical model of distress tells us that distress should be interpreted as a sign that the person is disordered or as a disorder. Distress, so, is conceptualized in broadly medical terms and should be treated, addressed primarily by medical means. So Deacon summarizes this very crude version of the biomedical model in these terms. The biomedical model posits that mental disorders are brain diseases and emphasizes pharmacological treatment to target presumed biological abnormalities. It's a very kind of crude and non-charitable description of the biomedical model, but you get the general gist. There are, of course, alternative models. So, for instance, the biopsychosocial model, as the word suggests, says that we should consider lots more factors. So, as well as biological factors that might be responsible for the onset of distress, such as genetics, for instance, there are psychological and social factors, certain types of behaviors that the person has experienced in their development, for instance, stress, trauma, migration, urban environments, and so on, and they can all be considered causes of distress. And then there is the PTM framework. So this is a newly introduced framework that has been recently launched by the British Psychological Society, and it's called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And it is a more radical departure than the biopsychosocial model from the biomedical model, as it is often described as leaving the biological and the medical behind entirely. It builds on the claim that distress is ultimately a way of coping. It's a reaction to an emergency, a crisis, a response to threats that are caused by power imbalances, inequalities, and adversities. Now, the power threat meaning framework is one instance of a more, I think, of a broader family of accounts that are described as trauma-informed approaches to distress. But the reason why I'm focusing on this, apart from the fact that it has been launched recently, so there is this very lively debate, is that I think we can really see the use of personally significant stories in the way in which people argue for and against the PTM framework. I should say that the framework is often presented as something that psychiatrists disagree about with psychologists. But that would not be, I think, a fair representation of the debate. Although psychiatrists tend to be more sympathetic as a group to the biomedical model, and psychologists, because they offer psychological therapies, tend to be more sympathetic to a less reductive account, in the case of the debate about the PTM framework, you've got them positioned all over the map. So you've got psychiatrists who support this new approach, and you've got clinical psychologists who are uncomfortable with it. And you've got everybody in between. So you've got academic philosophers participating, mental health activists, caregivers, people with lived experience, and so on. And what is interesting is that people with lived experiences might take very opposite views to whether PTM framework is a good idea. And I think that's where the controversy really starts becoming a bit radical and vicious. So what are the reasons in favor of the framework? Most of the people who speak very enthusiastically about the framework have an experience of distress and a history of trauma, and they tend to see their history of trauma as causally linked to their experience of distress. So they recognize themselves in this link that the framework makes very obvious and dominant between adversities or traumatic experiences and current distress. So traumatic experiences that happened in the past and distress that is present now. Another argument that you see very often associated with enthusiastic adoption of the framework is the argument against diagnosis. So people who think that the diagnostic labels are not valid, or they think that they are unhelpful, disempowering, not conducive to effective treatment, also tend to like the fact that PTM framework is very much anti-diagnosis. What about the reaction against the framework? Because the framework tends to reject diagnosis and pharmacological treatment altogether, and at times describe them as unethical, although there is a debate about whether they do think it's unethical or not. So, but sometimes definitely proponents of the framework have described them as unethical. These alienate some users who found pharmacological treatment helpful in their own cases, and some practitioners who think that there is not at the moment a viable alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. So to be completely honest, there is nobody who loves psychiatric diagnosis to bits and thinks that it's perfect. But there are people who think that it is a tool that can be improved, and until we've got a better way of getting people the help they need, then we shouldn't reject it altogether, or at least we shouldn't describe it as unethical as a practice. Some people point to the fact that sometimes distress does not seem to be related to trauma. And so their point is that although the PTM framework may be useful in some circumstances, is not an overall general account of distress. It cannot be generalizable to everybody who experiences distress. So before we get into examples of the debate, I just want to give you a glimpse of how personal stories are used in the debate about diagnosis. So for instance, some people react against the diagnosis because they do not recognize themselves in what the diagnosis implies about their behavior or character, and feel that having a diagnosis is unhelpful, potentially unjust, because it makes their realities unheard, irrelevant, or a production of the disorder that they are attributed, but they do not recognize as having. So for instance, some people don't like the term delusion because they think that their belief, as unusual as it may be, represents how reality is for them, and calling it a delusion or a psychotic symptom is automatically to invalidate their perspective on the world, right? So that's an example. The similar debate you've got about hallucinations, which again is a derogatory term for some people because it implies that they are not veridical experiences, whereas for some people hearing voices is helpful and it gives them a sense of the reality that they experience as they experience. So in the next slide, you've got an example from Jackie Dillon, who is a mental health campaigner and child abuse survivor, about diagnosis. So hearing voices, self-harm, eating disorders, and dissociation, when viewed objectively, are frequently classified as symptoms of serious mental illness and disordered personalities that require treatment, eradication, and cure. This convenient societal solution to the complex problem of endemic childhood abuse requires that victims of abuse endure further insult to injury and become the problem to be dealt with. So she's one of the authors of the PTM framework that I showed you before, and often she goes back to her own experience as having unfortunately had quite horrible experiences of child abuse and then developing symptoms that are, she didn't call symptoms, but like what has been diagnosed as schizophrenia. And she often describes how the process of going through receiving the diagnosis and being a reality not being in any way validated, nobody asking what her story was actually like re-experiencing abuse. It was, again, a source of distress in itself. For some people, diagnosis is helpful. So some people think that the moment in which they receive the diagnosis, they discover something about themselves that they were not able to understand before. So for instance, people think that the diagnosis may be coming as a relief, becomes a lens they can use to interpret how they feel, think, or act the way they do. And Ellen White, who's a young blogger with OCD, who has written about OCD, even received the Mind Award for blogging a few years ago, talks about how she identifies with hyper-responsibility, which is considered to be a symptom of OCD. I often describe hyper-responsibility as feeling as if you have the world's weight on your shoulders, that impending feeling of heightened responsibility that in turn makes you fear even the smallest of things. I really didn't choose to start believing that my thoughts would affect people's well-being, and that it was up to me to protect those close to me from ill health. It just comes as a trait of OCD. She's describing something that comes from her own experience, and according to her, it's really a symptom of the disorder she has. So this is embracing the diagnosis as opposed to rejecting. So how does this way of arguing based on personal experience happens when we're thinking about models of distress? So I want to illustrate how differences in viewpoints and preferred models of distress can be manifested in the telling of personal stories. And I'm going to consider two stories out there in the public domain. So in The Independent, Nick Webb writes about his mother's suicide and argues that conception of mental health, different from the biomedical one, could have saved her. The piece relies heavily on the tragic events in his mother's life that had an adverse impact on her well-being. On the other side, Linda Gask, in Touching the Soul, writes about why the PTM framework did not help her make sense of her own distress, and argues that we need a model that makes room for a variety of causal factors, including biology. So let's start with a Webb story. My mom had a controlling father in childhood who stopped her pursuing her life's ambitions. She was forced into a caring role as the oldest of 4 siblings and in place of her absent parents, and she suffered the death after only 6 weeks of her second baby. She experienced alcoholism, domestic violence, and a near complete lack of financial freedom in marriage, as well as the MS and loss of mobility she developed in her 50s, and the excruciating shame she felt for being sectioned by the state in her 60s. So when facing a person in distress, Webb goes on arguing, we should ask what happened to you, we should not ask what is wrong with you. Because what happened to you as a question leads to a more compassionate approach to their distress, and he explicitly cites the PTM framework as a welcome development in the way we think about mental health. The general conclusion of the article is about what we should do when facing a person in distress, but all he talks about is his mother's life story. And so one question is how generalizable is the case of Webb's mother to other people experiencing distress. Let's go over to Gask's story in Touching the Soul, her blog. I didn't experience anything like the trauma many of my patients did, but I was shamed and criticized, physically punished, and experienced a degree of emotional neglect and absent parenting. The PTM framework doesn't help me personally to make sense of that, although a therapist with a strong alliance to it might think differently. Neither does it help me to understand why my brother, alone amongst the members of our family, developed obsessive-compulsive disorder at the tender age of 7. So her argument, she continues, I've spent my life, since my very helpful therapy ended, coming to terms with my grief for the childhood that I did not have. I would have found the PTM framework helpful in understanding my battles with power in the NHS, and paradoxically perhaps with managers of psychological therapy services in particular. But it still doesn't explain why I, amongst my colleagues, was the one who got severely depressed. For that, I'd still argue a biopsychosocial framework is still needed. So she talks about the experiences of her brother and their own experiences and says, we all had similar traumatic childhood, but we reacted differently. Why is that? So Webb argues that a trauma-informed approach to distress is needed and can save lives, and the medicalizing coercive approach to distress that, for instance, his mother experienced, negatively affect people's well-being, make things worse, which is what Jackie Dillon was saying, right? It's like re-experiencing abuse all over again. Gask argues that the PTM framework cannot completely replace existing models of distress because her own case and her brother's case do not fit the model. Why do many people experience adversities but only some go on to experience distress? The next point is how we should respond to distress. In trauma-informed approaches, if distress is not the symptom of the disorder, then it should not be treated as a symptom of the disorder. So people who experience distress should not be considered ill. This has a number of consequences, including the kind of measures that should be taken to alleviate people's distress. And the PTM framework suggests that pharmacological interventions are not appropriate responses and should not be prescribed by healthcare professionals to people experiencing distress. Instead, if distress is the result of trauma, then in the short term, what we should do is try to understand people's life experiences and alleviating the effects of the traumatic events they experienced. And in the long term, we should change society. We should eliminate poverty and abuse, and protecting young people from adverse experiences. And I think you can read some of these of Webb's story. When Mom was sectioned 10 years ago, professionals told our family that she was psychotic and needed to be taken to hospital and given medication. The follow-up care from mental health professionals felt half-hearted and ineffectual. Seeing her sitting alone in the hospital garden, head bowed low and motionless, contributed, along with her clinical diagnosis, to everyone around her feeling that she was other, that she was untouchable, irretrievably ill. Today's public policy and service culture gives too much weight to the individual. So you go from the personal story to the general claim about what we should do. When someone is unemployed, for example, we say it's because they need to be more resilient. When someone is mentally unwell, we look for illness within the person, and the wider and external forces remain invisible. So Webb argues that his mother's diagnosis of being sectioned in particular did not help her feel better, made things much worse. And actually had a bad effect on the close social circle, right? Because people stopped seeing her as a person who needed help. But then we can of course ask whether sufficient evidence is offered for this claim based on the personal story that he reports, and whether actually we can think of the traditional response to distress in terms of pharmacological interventions as overall ineffectual based on one particular case. Gask's story also addresses how we should respond to distress. Suffering is experienced by persons, not merely by bodies, and has its source in challenges that threaten the intactness of the person as a complex social and psychological entity. Suffering can include physical pain, but is not limited to it. It is crucial that we respond empathically to address the suffering whatever we call it. To call it illness does not necessarily suggest a biomedical etiology. The sick role has its benefits, and it allows us time out of life and additional support and help in order to recover. And if everyone's response is normal, then why do some suffer much more than others? So again, you can see different approaches to calling something illness. For Webb, it's not helpful. It's not helpful to the person, it's not helpful to the social circle. For Gask, it may not be the perfect way of conceptualizing distress, but it has benefits. So another consequence of seeing distress as a normal response to life events, and that does not signal the presence of a disorder, is that the person experiencing distress is not assigned a sick role. And for Gask, it's not always a good thing, because the sick role gives you time out. Gask points out that the sick role is there to enable support and does not seem to be confined to issues that affect the person's body or brain alone. And I think there is underlying here something a bit different from what we've talked about. The conception of medicine is a bit broader. It doesn't just address physical illness, it addresses lots of different issues, lifestyle issues, for instance. If you think about obesity, is that an illness? No, it's something that doctors can do something about, but that doesn't, often coincide with what we think illness is. Okay, so I've given you the snippets of the debate. These people were not actually talking to each other. I've just considered what they were saying and put it together so that you can get a perspective on how personal stories are used. So what does it take to be responsible about the way we use stories as arguments in the debate? I mean, are we doing the right thing in sharing our own personal stories in this debate and drawing some general conclusion about what should be done? Personal stories, as we said already, carry some authority because they offer some insight into direct experiences that are often relevant to the debated issues. So for someone, for instance, like me, who does not have medical training, who has not experienced directly this distress to this extent, these stories are very informative and instructive because they tell me a little bit more about what it is like to go through these experiences. And as we said before, stories are also more powerful than other ways of defending a viewpoint sometimes because they are made more salient and memorable than statistical data, for instance, because they are about a person's life that we may immediately care about because of the structural narrative and the way we are geared towards story, attracted to stories. But this also suggests responsibility, right? If the story is more influential than other forms of making an argument, shouldn't we be careful about how we use it. Although a personal story is well suited to draw attention to some previously neglected or misunderstood issues, it is not the best way to defend a viewpoint in a debate because it is rarely sufficient to establish a general claim. This is just, there can be exceptions to this, but that's something that immediately comes to mind when we talk about anecdotal evidence in a derogatory way. It's because its evidence depends only on a small number of cases, and then the question emerges, should we consider this good evidence or not for the claim? To consider. Personal stories are by their very nature bad at providing support for comprehensive theories, in that they're about the experience of one person. If for one person, though, previous adversities can in part account for experienced distress, this does not tell us that distress can always be accounted for by previous adversities, and at the same time, a person finding medication useful in dealing with her distress does not prove that medication is always the best way to deal with distress. But when we put the two things together, I think we do learn something. So one story by itself might not really take us from the engaging narrative to a general position, but the combination of different stories making different points that are relevant to a debate may actually improve the epistemic standing that we have as observers of this debate who are trying to make up their mind about what to believe. So the fact that there are so many stories pulling the debate in opposite directions is itself instructive. Maybe distress has a variety of causes and can be addressed in a variety of ways, depending on the life history of the people involved and other relevant factors. Personal stories can contribute to debates being more inclusive and becoming less polarized if storytellers from opposite sides of the debate get to share the same platform. By being exposed to stories used to argue for conflicting viewpoints, the audience may acknowledge the different approaches will be needed to respond to distress in different circumstances. So if you had just heard about Jackie Dillon and Nick Webb, but not about Ellen White and Linda Gask, you'd have a very partial view of how people with an experience of distress view the trauma-informed approach. But the fact that you saw both viewpoints gives you a sense that there may be more than one story to be told. I want to take it a little bit farther, but not that much farther, because this is the research I hope to engage in rather than the research that I've already done. But one suggestion is that there could be strategies that we can apply for using stories responsibly in this context. And these are just two suggestions, and I'm really curious about what you think about them. One is the balancing strategy that I just suggested. So a story presenting one side of a complex issue can be accompanied by another story presenting another side, where the desired outcome is to promote a more balanced view of a controversial situation. And the other one is contextualizing, and I think you can do that just with one story at a time. Think about Nick Webb's story. I think it's an excellent story, but I think the conclusions he draws are often much more general than the story allows him to. We don't know a lot of things about his mother's situation that might explain some of the things that he said. So what about contextualizing? The story can be filled out with more relevant details and used as an argument for a narrower claim, rather than saying we shouldn't spend money on pharmacological treatment or we should stop hospitalizing people. What if he says, when a person has the kind of history that my mother has, then hospitalization may not be the best approach. It's kind of narrowing down the scope of the general claim. So balancing is really when you combine different approaches. It may be that it's good to be fed a variety of stories about distress. Some where distress appears as a symptom, and some where distress appears as a result of trauma. Contextualizing is really about making sure that we generalize from personal experiences, but not too much, up to a point where we do not seem to have sufficient evidence for the claims that we are making. Now, it's important that I'm advocating here something like consumption of stories. I'm not saying that we should police storytellers. You cannot tell your story in this context, or you have to tell it in a different way, because that doesn't seem to be something practical, and also it doesn't seem to be the kind of world I want to live in, where people tell me what kind of stories I have to say in what way, right? But it's different when you're thinking about the audience, because the audience, the person who's trying to make up her mind, has a responsibility to herself to have access to a variety of stories and to have the tools and resources to evaluate the stories as arguments. So storytellers participating in mental health debates often have a personal stake in their stories becoming the dominant one, which is part of their self-advocacy. It may be too demanding to expect that they engage in balancing and contextualizing strategies by themselves. In general, it sounds like a bad idea to police storytelling. However, consumers of stories should be expected to use stories that play the role of arguments responsibly. Don't know what that is, needs to be unpacked, but that's the idea, right? They can do so by gaining awareness of the different roles the stories can have and their different success conditions, and taking an active role in examining whether a story is a good argument for the viewpoint it defends. And I think there is a role there for philosophers to help them develop those tools. Tools that at the moment do not exist. So we know how to evaluate a belief, but we do not know how to evaluate a story as an argument. So this is where we may come in, by providing the means to establish some critical distance between vivid and engaging stories that move us, but that are used as arguments, and the audiences who participate in debates to which those arguments are relevant. So it would be really interesting to have an answer to the question, when is a personal and significant story a good argument? What are the situations in which we can use them? So here I'm just at the conclusions. So personal stories shared in public debates are more powerful than we may think. They often function as arguments for a viewpoint, whether that is the explicit intention of the tellers or just the way that they are used by others to access the stories and further share them. It's very common on social media where anybody can kind of own a story and make something out of it. Rather than blaming storytellers for sharing stories in the way they do, we should develop tools for growing a critical distance from compelling and engaging personal stories and for assessing stories as argument. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We've got a bit of time for some questions. I mean, it's quite tempting to want to get into the debate about which you're talking, but perhaps we should try and principally focus on the questions that you're interested in, is what role do stories play, or can they play, or should they play, and so forth. Right, I'll let you, yes, go.
So I just wondered about sort of the idea, so I don't know, you didn't really get into it, and I just wondered if it kind of was relevant or interesting, maybe, that the idea that like stories can be representative. So, you know, when you're kind of telling a story, you're like,
yes,
this is not anecdotal, I take this to be representative of something that is sort of valid. Have you thought about that, or whether that's kind of what people are doing or take themselves to be doing?
Yeah, I think there are different ways of unpacking how a story can be representative. So something that we looked at when we were thinking about how to frame the project was the idea that in many of these debates, the personal story plays an identity building role. Mm-hmm. So not only helps the person who is telling the story frame how they think about themselves in a certain way, but also draws people who have similar values and aspirations together. So I think that's maybe even more obvious in the Brexit debate. So sometimes there are stories that are not particularly personally significant stories that bring people together because people recognize not the experience in the story, but the values that are used in presenting the experience as an argument for or as an argument against a certain view. So for instance, we had an example where the same statement, which is things were much better a long time ago, was used for and against Brexit. So in the case of the anti-Brexit argument, it was like, oh, when we weren't part of the European Union, we all kind of took care of each other, and we were this big community. And my mom was making muffins for her neighbors when my neighbor was ill, when her neighbor was ill, but now she's in her 70s and nobody makes muffin for her. Brexit, right? But similarly, you find the opposite side of the debate doing this. So that these stories about German people coming over after the war, and despite the fact that a lot of British citizens were thinking that the Germans were responsible for destroying their cities, they were treated fairly and integrated. There was this sense that we were all European and so on. So no Brexit. It's like, what? So what is interesting about these stories, they are amazing, beautiful stories in their own right, but they seem to feed on certain values that some people recognize themselves in. So they may be representative in this sense. They may be what some people call, vehicles for identity beliefs. And so they're very useful from a psychological point of view, because it's very important for people to think that they are not isolated in their convictions, that they are part of something. And actually, part of the reason why people with psychiatric diagnosis sometimes suffer isolation is not so much their symptoms, but the fact that their symptoms make them feel apart from the rest of the community. They are not shared. They are not things that are shared. There are beliefs that are much more irrational than clinical delusions, like prejudice and superstition, but they are shared. So people do not feel alienated by having these beliefs, right? So it seems as if these kind of stories have a very important role in terms of making people belong, feel that they belong, at least. But at the same time, when they're used as arguments for a certain position, they seem to be very obviously not very good arguments by themselves. And then, of course, you could supplement them. You could just say they are an illustration of a more general point, and you could always build an argument that goes with it that sounds pretty good. But by themselves, they do not seem. So, there is that sense of representative. The other sense is the idea that, okay, this is my story, but actually there are a lot of people who have exactly the same story. And I think that's what's happening with the mental health debate. Service users are drastically divided. People with lived experience. Not everybody likes calling them service users, but they're drastically divided on the PTM framework. Some love it and some hate it. And they fight among each other a lot. And there is this issue, how do we go on in the debate if the people that we are building the model for do not, recognize them? Some of them recognize themselves in this model, but some of them drastically don't. What is it that we should do? So I think there is that sense that you may be a representative of a group, and in that sense, it's more than just the story of one person. It's the story of a lot of people who have had similar experiences. But I think it's still interesting to see how the story of many people who have had those experiences can weigh on the outcome of a debate. So I don't know whether you had some ideas about what representativeness could do in terms of shaping the direction of the debate, whether there was something behind the question, but at the moment I haven't got that far. Yeah.
I was wondering, the tools that you mentioned for growing that critical distance, who would that be aimed at? Like, could that be for could that be for lay people, and if so, what would that look like, or is it more academic?
So I think if it makes any sense at all, it will be for everybody. And then, of course, that poses a lot of challenges. Because if it is for everybody, you have to build it so that it can be accessed by everybody. So one idea that we had is this. For instance, young people in schools at the moment are receiving some education about how to be online. They call it sometimes internet safety. And these are things about don't share your password, don't interact with people you don't know in real life, and so on. But I think that could be expanded, for instance. So if we manage to develop a good justification for thinking of stories as arguments, and for thinking that they should be assessed as arguments when they're used in debates. And we could build a package where we develop a number of strategies that people could use when they are consuming a story. That could be embedded in something like use of social media and could be taught in schools. Not very young children, possibly, but secondary school, maybe 6th form. I think that would make sense. At the moment, they are doing internet safety in elementary school, primary schools as well. So I don't know whether there could be a version of this that would be
They do sort of
accessible.
spotting fake news, don't they? They've
Yeah.
started seeing those like as sort of tool, I guess, for trying to
Yeah.
spot fake news.
Exactly. So that it could be
Which is a
embedded in
similar
that.
kind of
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, I think it could be embedded in that, or it could be embedded in existing critical thinking modules. When we extend the idea that we evaluate beliefs and statements in newspaper articles to stories. So what do we do when there is the story? What is the story trying to do? Is it just trying to entertain us? Is it trying to give us a message? If it's trying to give us a message, is it giving us good reasons to believe the content of the message? That kind of thing. So I think it could be done in accessible ways, but it needs to start from the beginning. It needs to start with young people, because it's something that needs to become a way of being in these debates, a way of thinking about them.
I've now got 2 points actually. One picking up from that. So in Germany, you have propaganda fairly early on for obvious reasons, but that's kind of not all you want, right? Because these aren't people who see themselves as doing propaganda. So you'd want something slightly less politicized, maybe. But my other question is also about audiences. So, because I was thinking about the outgroup homogeneity and what we want from a mental disorder diagnosis, because part of the thing that we're trying to do, especially as as persons who don't have the condition or don't have that distress, is figure out what's going on. So I think there's also, even if you're trying to be responsible, there's a strong pressure from the people who are consuming stories that they don't want too many different stories because it's too difficult, and then they feel. I was thinking about it in the autism context as well. But you get the same thing with the schizophrenia and different ways of conceptualizing, that you then have the danger of getting skepticism about diagnoses or about the reality of there being something there, which might be unhelpful for the people who are trying to tell their stories. So that's just a practical problem, but it's a big practical problem.
No, I think this is interesting. So one idea is audiences. So critical skills are for everybody. Another thing is about platforms, right? So people who have platforms. So for instance, people who run group blogs or people who decide what goes on in their newspapers. I think they have a responsibility that we may think of the responsibility to give a voice to different sides in a debate. Now, this is very controversial, of course. There is all this kind of freedom of speech discussion right now. Who should you give a platform to? You shouldn't, right? And this idea that hate speech should never have a platform and so on. So, depending on how polarized the debates are and whether some of the sides of the debate can be identified with hate speech, this is controversial. But the idea is that something like Gask's story and Webb's story could have been featured, like in the same 2 pages of a newspaper, and people could have been made to think, why is it that she doesn't find the framework helpful, even if she did have trauma and she did have distress, while he finds the framework really helpful. And giving this kind of extra layer, it's not like having a lot of different stories, like multiplication of stories where you've got information overload, but having different points of view represented. One, it makes sense to do so, and then we have to give a lot of thought about in what context that's appropriate.
Yeah, I would say something a little bit about the balancing idea, which I think is a nice one, but it will vary from some contexts where it's helpful, as you just described, to others where it may actually not be very helpful.
Yeah.
So the kind of case I'm thinking of is the whole MMR vaccine debate.
Which
And
is one of the
yes, in some ways, part of the problem is that there, as it were, the media were trying to be too responsible in terms of balancing, and what we got was your scientists giving us the data on one side, not stories, and then your handful of stories from the parents who are supporting the whole Wakefield thing with their stories about their children, and then having the vaccine, and a few weeks later, you're showing first signs of autism. And there, as well, in some sense, the balance just misrepresents the way the world is. In fact, badly misrepresented, because the bit that's most compelling, for all the reasons you said, is the bit that actually is deeply unrepresentative of the way the world is. So, it depends on what the role of the stories is in the balance.
Yeah, that's why it's so difficult. I mean, one thing that we did have in the longer description of the project is what we can do about this. And so there are some people in science communication, for instance, who argue that scientists should communicate in different ways and using stories, for instance. Some very interesting, very recent papers suggesting that that there may be a way of kind of balancing out the way in which people may be kind of drawn naturally to stories because they're vivid, easier to understand, and maybe kind of it may be off-putting, for instance, to think about lots of scientific data because maybe they don't have conceptual resources to analyze it. But I think
it's difficult, though.
But it's difficult, yeah, of course.
Because for two reasons. One is, in that case, as it were, so even if the scientists had come up with stories, what would their stories be? Of parents whose children had MMR vaccines and were just fine?
Or children who didn't have the vaccine and then got measles.
Or got measles, but that's right. But perhaps that's what you would want.
I agree.
In some sense, even the good stories, as it were, are less compelling, as it were, than the bad news stories. That's why we want those ones.
To say about that, so there is a very interesting literature on charity, for instance, and why is it that charities always use stories of individual people and possibly a very beautiful picture? And if you read the small print, is never the picture of the person that the story they are telling. It's always an actor, right? But it's because but it's okay. But because they've discovered, and there is a lot of hard evidence behind it, that people are much more motivated to give if they are exposed to the personal story, even if it's just one person. But if they tell them 1 million people have experienced this, still, not giving, right? But if it's one person, and it has a lot of psychological. It makes a lot of psychological sense because given one story, we feel we can help this particular girl, right? But if you're told 1 million people are in this situation, it's not going to make any difference, right? Whether I give my 5 pounds or not. So I think there is a lot of work to do in how powerful, but there is also a lot of work that has been done, and it needs to be kind of interpreted and adapted to the context at hand about why stories are so powerful and what we can do. But I think the other claim that I was making, that we need to develop resources to assess stories as arguments, that can help with those debates. For instance, the anti-vaxxers. Because if I know that one particular story doesn't immediately give me reasons to endorse a general claim of a certain type, I will be more skeptical. But it needs to be done, as we were saying, when you're young and you're developing. It's very difficult to try to persuade people who already have taken sides and who feel this strong belonging to us. It's part of their identity to be an anti-vaxxer, to be a Trump supporter. It's very difficult to change their mind at that point. No critical skill training will do that, realistically. But if we raise citizens who have those resources, who know that stories can be used in this way, who can recognize when stories are used as arguments, and in that moment, they apply the evaluation package that we propose for them. And they say, okay, this is a very powerful story, very interesting story, but does it get me to this general conclusion? Then I think we can tackle it, but it's an extremely complex. And so not everything will work. I mean, the balancing, I think, works a little bit for this mental health debate. because, and now we are entering a little bit in the debate, I think it's, when I read these stories, my sense is, why are you arguing with each other? It's compatible. What you're saying is absolutely compatible.
Yes.
To say that something is an illness doesn't rule out that trauma caused it, or doesn't rule out that trauma is part of the reason why you're experiencing in this particular way. So, in this particular case, I think it's helpful to have the stories side by side, because you can see that they are not really as polarized as they are presented. And then you can ask the question, why are they presented as so polarized? And I think there are, again, identity issues here. And I think they're very powerful. But in other contexts, it may not be the right strategy. And I think that would be part of the job to do, no? Which strategies apply to which type of debate and why. Sorry, you had a point to something stage, but I always...
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I keep jumping
talking
in.
too much.
So I was thinking about another thing which is relevant in the psychiatry context, I think, is that you have this, that the roles are very unevenly distributed, because you have the people with lived experiences, and they in many ways have the best stories, and they have a special authority because they have the authority from experience. And then you have the psychiatrists who also have a special authority, but it's a different one. I mean, obviously they can also tell case studies, but in the more sort of theoretical arguments, then it's going to be things like statistics and pathways and all that kind of stuff. And I think that makes the debate even more difficult, because people have different resources for staking their claim. So that's basically saying here's another way in which it's difficult. It's not actually a positive contribution.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting that a lot of the people very active in this debate are both mental care professionals and people with lived experience, like Linda Gach, but also Lucy Johnston, the main author of the I think it's interesting because they can have stories
authorities.
as a person with lived experience and as a professional. But yeah, the source of the story, I think, is also.
So one way to think about some of the issues in when there's a story presented as an argument, a good argument or not, is, well, the thing about stories is that one of the things about stories are many things, but one of them is, I thought, well, they're single cases. So the question is so from a logical point of view, is when is a single case basis for a good argument? Well, or a poor argument? Well, one of them, as you pointed out, obviously it's a basis for a poor argument on its own if as of what you're doing is generalising. It's not always bad, but
no,
it's often that will be bad. But when is arguing from a single case a good argument? Well, one of the things is when you're trying to falsify some general claim that people might have made or might be inclined to make. So, so if people had in their minds that hospitalisation and drugs are always a good idea, then the story that it was harmful or might be harmful is a useful counterexample and falsify the general claim. It's always the thing to do. And the other kind of case seems to me is the single cases can be useful for you're pointing out how possible, and is it possible and how possible, and the cases that you gave of giving stories about that just seem to be almost sort of contradictory, implanted thoughts and those kinds of, well, what we would call them delusions or otherwise. The stories you make it clear to us how there's a possible, or that it's possible and how it's possible, in a way that.
Yeah.
So I think that that's only a sort of limited use of it, but it seems to me that those two are natural things to think about.
So one thing that I was originally thinking is kind of a very Popperian thought, but it can be the counter example, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a general trend of thought, then the story can break the mold there. Another thing is maybe the heuristic role. So it may be, I'm thinking about, for instance, take the Brexit debate. Some people are saying Brexit has created an environment of hostility where there are more hate crimes that are based on people being foreigners or not speaking English and so on. Now, I think in order to justify that kind of claim, that it has been Brexit that has created this environment or the kind of the debate that has followed it, you need evidence, like proper evidence. You need to see, how many hate crimes there were before, how many there are now, whether the hate crimes that are available now can be reconducted to that, and so on. But I think in order to start wondering whether that's an issue, I think telling stories is helpful. So you may not even know that that's a potential issue that should be scientifically investigated until you start hearing stories. And stories accumulate. So for instance, in kind of European citizen groups, this is very common. Like people post, this happened to my daughter yesterday, we were talking Spanish on the bus and they started shouting at us. And then someone else, this happened to me. I was talking Polish to my child at school, and then you kind of realize, okay, this is not just one case, it's more than one case, and then you start creating a situation or an hypothesis that is worth scientifically investigating, but you might not have known that it was an issue before, the personal stories were told. Another similar one is like kind of mental health issues emerging from the uncertainty that certain people have experienced after Brexit or in other situations and so on. So it may be that the story itself doesn't prove the point, but the story gives you the kind of the doubt of it, makes you think about the general question. Is there a phenomenon here? And then you go the proper scientific way to examine that, but you might not have got there if you didn't have the story. So it seems as if there is kind of this heuristic. So it's not really a role as an argument, but a role as kind of suggesting a hypothesis to be properly investigated. That seems to be quite common in this kind of debate. And I think similar story can be done similar ideas can be run through the mental health debate. So this idea about how do you say electroconvulsive therapy and its effects. I think it's something that needs to be scientifically investigated. There seem to be, I'm not an expert, but there seem to be studies pointing in different directions. The fact that there are people who have stories going one way or the other may actually invite you to gather evidence, kind of more evidence, more robust evidence with bigger samples and get to the bottom. I don't know, I'm thinking that, stories may have this role. It may be that sometimes the story does not point to the general claim that it seems to point to, and we can discover that once we've done the science, but it may be that it's the first step.
Getting towards the end of our time, but if there's any more questions, this is your chance.
I don't really have a question, I'm just sort of thinking, I guess I can think out
Yes,
loud.
that's what we're here for, man.
I was just thinking about, because around the whole Brexit time, that whole thing with social media, I'm sure there's a technical term for it, but how it, do you know what the word is? Where it like made the things that appeared on your Facebook wall, say, fit with what Facebook thought you would believe in.
Yeah.
So, because I was thinking about the stories and the stories you see on your wall and stuff, and I guess how the stories that are chosen for your Facebook kind of perpetuate a view that you probably already have, or are kind of, or Facebook thinks you want to have. And this is why I say I don't really have a question. I'm just thinking where this sort of fits in with that, because you're already on that path, and it's just all these stories coming at you, which kind of make you more and more, and that is kind of part of the
We were thinking about
polarization.
that actually when we were writing about this, and so I think it's called echo chamber. So it's like when you just kind of keep getting views that seem to be quite similar to yours, so to support what you already believe. And I think the balancing strategy may be helpful for that too. So
But
it was pointed out.
Would Facebook allow would Facebook let those appear?
It
Because
should,
It should.
ethical arguments, it should.
But yeah.
In practice, no. I mean, so for instance, this is kind of autobiographical, but I never really understood the Trump thing. Who is supporting Trump, right? And so one day, because I was working on this, I said, okay, I want stories. I want to see who is supporting Trump, because I cannot imagine. Like when I'm trying to think about the person who supports Trump, it doesn't come easy to me. And I went on Facebook in these groups. Some groups are open, Trump supporters. It was like an eye-opener. Like, there are people who actually have arguments for supporting Trump, and tell stories, a lot of stories. A lot of stories. And I think if I didn't have this research question at the back of my mind, I wouldn't have gone there. Facebook would have not shown me any of those posts, even if they're publicly available, right? And that's interesting. Like, so the story that plays on your identity, you feeling that you belong to a certain group of people because you share so much with them and so on, maybe. And makes you always feel that you are home, right? Because everybody around you, and gives you this completely distorted image. Like I was thinking, why so many people voted for? I can't think, because all I was getting from Twitter are people who were supporting the opposite side, and I couldn't even imagine. So I think that's where the balancing is interesting and important, to make you understand what is the point of view of the person, and possibly reducing polarization. These are people who have suffered in many ways, who are suffering, who don't have good lives, and this is the way they are reacting to that, and it's really an eye-opener, like story after story. But I think but Facebook, newspapers, what should do a little bit more of is, rather than having newspapers to just support Trump and newspapers to just publish things against Trump, to have them side by side. Because people who do not read the New York Times do not get to hear arguments against Trump. They watch Fox News, they don't. It's that kind of thing.
Do you mean less sensational? More informative?
It's just that at the moment there seems to be this, and it's the same with Brexit in this country. Some newspapers are all for, some newspapers are all against, and if you just buy one newspaper, you don't get to hear the other argument ever. And it might not make much of a difference at this point, because these debates are so polarized, and people kind of tend to hate each other just because they have different views. But if at the beginning, when these views were being formed, people had more access to both sides of the debate, to both concerns, really, why people were worried about these things, why they were thinking in that way, I think it might have made some difference. So I think there is a responsibility for people who are responsible for the spreading and sharing of stories.
Can I just ask you one thing? So a lot of it is, as you said, through social media and the explosion of everything, but so in a way you can reach those people because you know how to. What about people who are not on social media? What about people who don't do Facebook, don't do Twitter, don't do anything? They just, how do you get to them, and how do you pass your message? Because that platform is heavily criticized for what it churns as stories, but in a way it provides you access.
Yeah, if you want to look for things, you can.
Correct. If you take that platform away for a whole generation of people who actually don't want social media, how do we get to them?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think some of those mechanisms are reproduced in real life. So it may be that, for instance, I tend to spend time with my colleagues, not with, my neighbors, let's say. My colleagues are likely to think about certain things in similar ways
to you.
So even in real life, I think you reproduce these echo chambers. You are most likely to socialize with people who share a lot of values and ideas with you. Not always, because, that's not always the case. But I think, that's just the way we associate with one another. That's the way we kind of... maybe, for instance, it may happen that when you've got someone who is very vocal about an opinion that is different from yours, you tend to... And I think this has happened a lot after Brexit. You hear about families like not speaking to each other anymore, and you just say, I don't want to hear this person rambling about this again. It's just, and you stop seeing them. So I think some of those mechanisms are not just on social media. But social media exasperates them. Yeah, makes them more evident. I mean, it's easier in a certain way to avoid hearing about certain things.
I was thinking it's easier to balance. I was trying to go like it's easy for you then to balance because you put two stories. For those who actually don't use these medias, it's harder to get to them to balance because, like you say, they will socially hang out with people that have similar socio-demographics.
I mean, the other thing is that sometimes the virtual environment is positive in the sense that people would never openly voice their views because they don't want their face to be associated with something because they feel they will be sanctioned. They are happy to do it on social media if they have an anonymous account or something that cannot be linked to them, or on fora. I think this is very important for mental health. You find lots of really good first-person accounts of mental distress in fora where people do not have to say who they are because they know that if they talk about it with their friends, they may be discriminated against, there may be stigma associated with it, but if they do it there, they've got this kind of freedom. So in some ways, it's not always negative, I think. There are, if what we want to know is know more about the experience of people who may not be able to tell their experience or may not feel like telling their experience face to face, then I think sometimes this kind of having other environments where they can do it in a safe way because they're not identified with their views. Safe up to a point. There is trolling, of course, and everything else. But it may be potentially better. But yeah, I don't know. I think partly it's an empirical question whether in real life we do tend to have these echo chambers and to what extent and whether it's worse or not as or better than on social media. And you then be sure about the answer to that question.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Come to the end of our time, I'm afraid to say. But
thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. That's us for the term, I'm afraid. But we'll be back next time.